What makes young voters tick? Recently, I have read multiple articles trying to answer this question. Of course, young people aren't the only demographic being examined for their voting behavior, but this is a demographic I bring up in this video because I think there is something that I can add to the conversation. In articles that I have been reading, they seem to be missing something when trying to understand the concern of young voters. I think I have figured out what one of these concerns are, and it's an economic phenomenon that I don't hear being discussed a lot in news articles or in the media, but I think it's been on the mind of young voters for a while and has influenced the way they vote. I call this economic phenomenon millennial inflation. Millennial inflation is a long-standing issue that I don't think affected the behavior of young voters just in the past election, but I think it's an underlying issue that's influencing the expectations that young voters have for their elected representatives, and thus their thoughts on whether or not their elected representatives are meeting their expectations. So what is millennial inflation? Hello, I am the Knight of the Basilisk. I just want to let you know that I won't be mentioning out loud the sources that I'm citing in this video, but I will have them shown on screen, and I'll try to have links for everything in the description below, although there is a limit to how much I can include in the description of the video. But please look on screen if you wish to see the articles that I am citing. I won't be actually mentioning them out loud because they disrupt the flow of my discussion. And also, notice the dates of the articles. I'm going to be discussing millennial inflation, and most people think of inflation as something that occurred during Joe Biden's administration or during the supply chain issues of the pandemic. Some of these articles occur before 2020, just to bring that up. Okay, so what is millennial inflation, and why is it driving politics? Or why is it influencing young people's expectations for what they want from their political representatives? So let's discuss normal inflation first. Normal inflation is the increase in the cost of goods in any given economy. Usually it's attributed to an increase in money supply introduced into the economy. It could be something like supply chain issues or just anything that increases the cost of goods. So let's say the cost of everything in the economy raises by 5%, then there's 5% inflation. And I think during the early Joe Biden years, we experienced inflation that was around 10% year over year. Year over year being comparing the price of an item in October of one year and October the year before, or comparing the difference in the price of a good 12 months apart. Millennial inflation is different than the cost of the general goods in the economy. So over the past 20 to 30 years, the cost of education has gone up. The cost of housing has gone up. And these two things are special because they are more likely to impact young people the most. So young people are more likely to go to college, and young people are more likely to buy their first house without benefiting from selling an existing home. Whereas if the cost of housing goes up, that increases the amount you could sell an existing home for. And there are some other things that have gone up that affect more young people disproportionately more, like healthcare. It's not just young people that are affected by healthcare, but at least people of a certain age can apply for Medicare. So the age of which the cost of healthcare affects someone is skewed a little bit young, although it does affect more people of all ages. But okay, specifically education and housing have gone up. And so these two things affect the cost of people who are starting a new life. So the cost to start a new life, to buy your first house, or to get an education has gone up. And I'm not just talking about the price of a house, it's the price of an apartment. So if the cost of rent goes up, then that affects someone who is renting. And young people are more likely to rent than old people generally because they haven't yet bought their first house, which they have a hard time doing because the cost of housing has gone up and they don't have an already existing house to sell. In my humble opinion, millennial inflation has been occurring for about 15 plus years, which means it's been occurring before Bidenomics occurred and before the pandemic. I believe millennial inflation caused young people to view Bernie Sanders favorably in 2016. I think millennial inflation has been influencing politics since then. But wait a minute, if this is the truth, why haven't we noticed before? Well, think about it like this. If a $2 item increases to $2.20, that item experienced 10% inflation. And if a $200,000 house increased in price to $220,000, that's also 10% inflation. That's 10% inflation for both of them. But if the $2 item did not increase in price, but the $220,000 house increase, the average is 5% inflation, which is the halfway point. That's if you simply average the percentages themselves, not the price. In total, the cost of goods has gone up $20,000, and a $2 item doesn't have much impact. So really, you should think of it as 10% inflation rather than the midway 5% inflation. But what if you're averaging the cost of that $200,000 house to a whole bunch of items that are $2, $5? Is a $200,000 house weighed the same, or do you how do you average it fairly? When calculating the inflation, the cost of goods is weighed. Some goods weigh more than others. So the cost of goods are weighed differently when calculating inflation, but was it weighed sufficiently? So if housing prices have gone up faster than inflation overall over the past 15, 20 years, did the way we weigh inflation capture that? And of course, the price of education and housing didn't just increase faster than inflation, but increased faster than wages. And my personal experience with rent, back in 2012, I moved into an apartment, and it was $1,050 a month rent. Because of rent control, as in rent can only go up so much for an existing tenant in a year, by the mid-2015, I was paying $1,230 in rent. But the people coming in after me, well, the people running the apartment can charge them whatever because they're new tenants. They were going to pay $1,600 a month. So that is roughly a 50% increase in rent over the course of 3 years. The increase in housing costs weren't a phenomenon specific to the pandemic, despite what the news media tells you. Housing prices have been overinflated since probably 2015. I'm not quite sure, but you can look at the dates in the articles that I'm citing in this video to get an idea. But basically, millennial inflation has been occurring since well before the pandemic, well before Bidenomics. And like I said, it affects the cost of someone starting a new life, which means in order to afford these things, they either have to delay getting them or go into debt. And even if they delay them, it's still so much they might have to go into debt anyways. So debt is negative wealth. And the higher the education and housing costs, that puts young people starting a new life, in a larger hole they have to dig themselves out of to obtain positive wealth. So I answered what millennial inflation is, but let's think about how it affects the voting behavior of young people. So, do you remember back in early Joe Biden years how there was inflation and everyone was talking about it? Everyone was talking about Bidenomics and how inflation was going up under Joe Biden, and it was like around 10% year over year. I forget the exact number. But everyone was complaining about it. Everyone was complaining about prices going up. Everyone was complaining about Bidenomics, about inflation. Now, see, that is when all Americans experience inflation. However, millennial inflation is the inflation experienced disproportionately by young people, or my generation, millennials. And of course, there's a younger generation after mine, Gen Z, and it's affecting them too. Of course, I call it millennial inflation because I'm a millennial and I'm old enough to see the start of things going up and the start of when it wasn't so bad, and young enough to really feel the pinch. Like, I had not bought my first home and I seen the home prices get out of control and almost impossible for me to afford. So yeah, I'm young, old enough to see the trend starting and young enough to be affected by it. And it has upset me. I'm trying to buy my first house. I've been unable to. And of course, like I said, rent was going up for me, but if I had stayed in that apartment, it would just kept going up and up and up until it got to $1,600 a month. In fact, now I think it's over $20,000 a month for just a one-bedroom apartment in that apartment that I had moved into in 2012. That was just a one-bedroom apartment. And, that's a burden for me. That's a cost. So increase in costs are burden to people. Just look at what happened during the early Joe Biden years. So if the American people were upset over inflation during the early Joe Biden years, don't you think millennials would be upset over inflation that they've suffered? They've suffered from the inflation of education and housing, and it's affected them since before the public at large was complaining about inflation. And like I said, I think it affected the popularity of Bernie Sanders because he talked about making education affordable. And of course, young people saw that and were like, oh, wow, yeah, education has really affected me. That would be a great thing. Millennials would see that positively. And Bernie Sanders also talked about making healthcare universal. I think the term was Medicare for all. And healthcare costs have gone up. And so what makes young people vote the way they do? Well, when the representatives don't meet their expectations, they vote them out. Or at least a portion of young people shift their vote or try fishing around. So if there are polls that say young people shifted partially towards Donald Trump, they didn't go overwhelmingly for him, but more young people went for Donald Trump in this past election than they did in the election before. Why is that? Well, Donald Trump talked about freedom cities. Freedom cities is basically building cities on federal land. Well, oh my gosh, that might help the housing crisis. So as a young person, I heard about freedom cities. I'm like, wow, that might help bring housing costs down. Now, of course, it turned out that it's some attempt to allow tech bros to create their own mini utopias, whatever. So I don't think it's going to be as good, but I found that out after Trump got elected. And of course, I didn't vote for Trump, but think of a possibility of a millennial might have heard about freedom cities before the election and thought, oh, well, Trump might address the housing crisis. So, just think about all the ways that inflation got people upset during the early Joe Biden years. Did it affect their vote? Probably affected some people's vote. Why wouldn't it affect millennial votes? Especially since millennial inflation started before the Bidenomics and is continuing. Anyways, I just wanted to add some snippets to the conversation about what makes young people vote the way they do. It's just food for thought. Just trying to stir up just trying to make people consider certain issues. Hopefully this was insightful. I am the Knight of the Basilisk. Thank you for listening and have a good day. Goodbye.